Somewhere beneath the Lake of the Ozarks, 40 feet down in the cold dark at the bottom of a cove that used to be a river valley, there is a town. Old Linn Creek, Missouri, county seat of Camden County since 1855. Population 553 at the 1930 census. It had a courthouse, a jail, 2 car dealerships, a barber shop, gas stations, churches, cafes, and over 100 buildings. Today, it has fish. And the locals say that on certain quiet nights, if you anchor your boat in the right spot and cut the engine, you can still hear the old church bell ringing from beneath the water. Nobody has ever explained how a bell with no one to ring it produces sound. Nobody has ever needed to. The story tells you everything you need to know about the Lake of the Ozarks. Something is always happening beneath the surface that you aren't supposed to see. 5 million people visit this lake every year. It stretches 92 miles end to end. It has more shoreline, 1,150 miles of it, than the entire coast of California. It generates over 500 million kilowatt hours of electricity annually, enough to power 42,000 homes. It hosts boat parties so legendary that the New York Times once called one cove the oldest established permanent floating bacchanal in the country. And the whole thing, every cove, every marina, every waterfront mansion, every neon-lit honky-tonk on the Bagnell Dam strip exists because 100 years ago, a lawyer with a dream found a banker with a problem, and together they ran one of the most audacious land swindles in Missouri history. The lawyer's name was Ralph Street. He was from Kansas City, and the idea seized him as early as 1912. Dam the Osage River in the Missouri Ozarks and harness the drop in elevation to generate hydroelectric power. It was not an original concept. Down in southern Missouri, a similar project was already taking shape on the White River, and by 1913 that dam had created Lake Taneycomo. Street looked at the Osage and saw something bigger. The river drained over 14,000 square miles of the Ozark Plateau. It dropped enough elevation to spin turbines. And most importantly, the land along its banks was cheap because the people who lived on it were poor. That last part mattered more than Street probably admitted to himself. The Osage River Valley in the early 1900s was not a destination. It was a place people lived because their families had lived there before them, because the land was their land, and the river was their river, and that was enough. The communities across Benton, Camden, Morgan, and Miller counties were home to families of German, Scotch-Irish, and indigenous descent. Homesteaders, squatters, subsistence farmers who raised what they ate and bartered for what they didn't. There was no electricity. There were no paved roads, just trails that could be navigated by foot, by horse, or by wagon. A few small towns had sprung up along the river: Linn Creek, Gladstone, Irontown, serving as trading posts and steamboat landings. The economy was largely cashless. A man's wealth was measured in what he could grow, what he could hunt, and how many acres of bottomland the river had left him after the spring floods receded. It was, in short, the kind of place that powerful men in Kansas City and St. Louis tended to look at not as a home, but as a resource. And Ralph Street looked at it and saw a lake. For more than a decade, Street spent time in the north-central Ozarks, surveying land, building relationships with engineers and real estate negotiators, trying to assemble the money and the political connections needed to make a privately funded dam a reality. He got as far as securing a preliminary permit from the Federal Power Commission in November 1924. A week later, a new corporation was chartered, the Missouri Hydroelectric Power Company. Its capital stock consisted of 500 shares with no par value. Walter P. Cravens held 498 of them. Ralph Street held one. A man named Walter Eisel held the last. That lopsided stock distribution tells you who was really in charge by 1924, and it was not Ralph Street. Walter P. Cravens was the president of the Kansas City Joint Stock Land Bank, and he was a man sitting on a mountain of trouble. The agricultural depression had started long before 1929. Farm prices had been collapsing since the end of the First World War, and Cravens' bank had financed hundreds of farms across Kansas and Missouri that were now in foreclosure. He was buried in what the court documents would later call frozen assets, deeds to land nobody wanted to buy. Farm after farm in Kansas, with no farmers left on them. Cravens needed a way to make those worthless deeds worth something, and Street, the dreamer, needed money. What happened next was either a stroke of genius or a criminal conspiracy, depending on which side of the courtroom you were sitting on. Cravens looked at the two problems, his pile of foreclosed Kansas farms and the fact that building a dam required acquiring tens of thousands of acres of Ozark river bottom land, and saw one elegant solution. He would trade the Kansas farms to the Ozark families whose land was about to be flooded. The pitch was straightforward. We'll give you farmable land in Kansas or western Missouri, good flat prairie land, in exchange for the rocky hills and river bottoms you're living on. You won't mind giving up your property because it's going underwater anyway. You'll come out ahead. On paper, it might have looked reasonable. In practice, it was a scheme to launder the bank's failed assets by dumping them on people who didn't understand what they were signing. The Ozark families were being offered land that the bank couldn't sell on the open market, land that was in foreclosure precisely because it wasn't worth farming, in exchange for property that, once the dam was built, would become the shoreline of the largest man-made lake in the United States. The people doing the losing were subsistence farmers with no lawyers, no experience with real estate transactions, and in many cases no real comprehension that a dam could actually turn their river into a lake. The people doing the winning were sitting in offices in Kansas City. To handle the transactions, Cravens created another entity, Farmers Fund, Inc., organized in April 1925 to deal in bonds, mortgages, and securities. Its articles of incorporation claimed a capital stock of $100,000. In reality, less than $9,000 of that was cash. The rest was, you can probably guess, more mortgages on more foreclosed real estate. The shell game was already spinning. Money from the land bank was flowing into the hydroelectric company and Farmers Fund, and surveyors and real estate men were fanning out across the Ozarks, knocking on doors, talking to families who had never heard the word hydroelectric before, asking them to trade their homes for land in Kansas they'd never seen. Some people took the deals, some refused. Many were simply confused. As historian Kent Van Landeet put it, the people in the Ozarks were really in disbelief and really hardly accepted the idea that their land would actually go underwater. They didn't believe a dam could hold back a river. They didn't believe the water would reach their farms, tucked up in hollows and valleys that seemed so far from any river. And they didn't understand the legal documents that men from the city were pushing across kitchen tables. J.W. Vincent, the editor of the Linn Creek Reveille, the local newspaper he'd been publishing since 1879, wrote editorials opposing the dam. The people of Linn Creek were, by most accounts, against the whole idea. But being against something and being able to stop it are two very different things, particularly when the people pushing it have a land bank, a power company, and friends in government. Then, in 1927, the scheme collapsed. Or rather, the legal machinery caught up with it. Walter Cravens was indicted for misappropriation of land bank funds. The charges were devastating, 88 counts. The federal government argued that Cravens had diverted the bank's assets into his speculative dam project, using depositors' money to fuel a private venture through a web of shell corporations. It was, in essence, a case about a man who tried to turn a failing bank into a hydroelectric empire by laundering bad paper through the bodies of Ozark farmers. Cravens fought the charges. He appealed his 1928 conviction all the way to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. In 1932, the appeals court laid out the whole architecture of the scheme in its opinion: the hydroelectric company, the Farmers Fund, the land swaps, the flow of money, and denied the appeal. In 1933, Cravens reported to the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, to begin a 6-year sentence. He paid his $25,000 fine in installments. Federal prisoner number 43517 was discharged on February 7, 1937, after serving 3 years and 9 months. Ralph Street, the dreamer who started it all, landed on his feet. When Cravens went down, Street pivoted. He took a job with Union Electric, the St. Louis utility company that had been watching the Osage River project with increasing interest. Because here's the thing about the Cravens scandal. It discredited the man, but it didn't kill the idea. The permits were still valid. The surveys had been done. The engineering studies conducted by the Boston firm Stone and Webster showed that the Osage was an ideal site for a hydroelectric dam. And Union Electric, under its president Louis Egan, saw an opportunity to acquire a project that others had done the hard preliminary work on, and do it right, with corporate money and corporate muscle. On July 27, 1929, Union Electric acquired all properties and rights of the Missouri Hydroelectric Power Company. 10 days later, on August 6, 1929, construction began on what they called the Great Osage River Project, or simply, Project number 459. The final price tag would be $30 million, making it the largest privately funded construction project in the United States, and the last major dam in the country built entirely with private capital. 4 months later, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. The dam didn't stop. The funding was already committed, and Union Electric had the resources to push forward. And so, while the rest of America was lining up at soup kitchens and watching their savings evaporate, the Osage River Valley became one of the few places in the country that was hiring. Union Electric employed over 20,000 people over the course of the project, with 4,000 working at any given time. The pay was 35 cents an hour. Not much even then. But in an era when a farm laborer might make 50 cents a day, the dam wages were extraordinary. Workers poured in from across the region, and with them came their families, and with the families came the need for housing, schools, stores, a hospital. An entire temporary city rose up around the construction site. The dam itself was a feat of brutal, hand-powered labor. The engineering firm of Stone and Webster out of Boston designed the structure. A concrete gravity dam 148 feet tall and 2,543 feet long, relying on its own sheer weight to hold back the force of the river. Most of the work was done without the mechanized equipment that would become standard later. Steam shovels handled some of it, but men with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows did the rest. Union Electric built a railroad into the area to move materials, installed a dredge to pull gravel from the riverbed for concrete, erected a sawmill to cut lumber, and constructed a power plant just to run the construction site. Nearly 60,000 acres of land had to be acquired. 30,000 acres had to be cleared of trees and brush. 1 million cubic yards of earth and rock had to be moved. The amount of concrete poured was enough, people said, to build an 18-foot wide highway from St. Louis to Topeka, Kansas. The freight cars needed to haul the materials would have formed a train stretching from St. Louis to Tulsa. And while the dam rose, the towns downstream prepared to die. Old Linn Creek is the one everyone remembers because it was the county seat and the largest of the doomed communities. But there were others. Irontown, a company town on Bollinger Creek with an iron smelter that still pokes above the waterline today. Arnholt's Mill, a grist mill on the Big Neangua River. Gladstone, population roughly 150. Nonsuch, Passover. Zebra, named for the striped bluffs nearby. 8 towns in all were cleared and submerged. In Linn Creek, the process was orderly in the way that demolitions are orderly, which is to say it was efficient and heartbreaking. Wooden buildings were burned. Some structures were relocated piece by piece to higher ground. The Methodist church's bell, pews, flooring, and stained glass were loaded onto wagons and carried to the new Linn Creek a few miles away on a hilltop. A new county seat, Camden was purpose-built to replace what was about to disappear. The county prosecutor was a 26-year-old named Morgan Moore Molder, from the family that J.W. Vincent had called the most numerous and prominent in the county. Molder filed a temporary injunction to stop the flooding. The injunction, as one local historian noted dryly, held no water. On February 2, 1931, just 16 months after construction began, the gates of Bagnell Dam were closed, and the Osage River began to back up. The lake started filling, slowly at first, then faster. The water crept into the valleys and hollows, climbing the hills, swallowing fields and fence posts and foundations. People came from across the region just to watch the reservoir fill, standing on the bluffs as the water consumed the landscape below. By May 20th, the water had reached the spillway crest elevation of 660 feet. 10 days later, on May 30th, 1931, two sisters named Oma and Noma de Graffenried drove their 1924 Chevrolet coach car across the top of Bagnell Dam, and the Lake of the Ozarks was officially opened. Below them, 40 feet down, old Linn Creek sat in silence. The irony of the lake's birth, that it was conceived by a con artist, financed through fraud, built over the protests of the people it displaced, and completed just as America hit economic bottom, didn't stop it from becoming exactly what the dreamers and schemers had promised. The lake drew visitors almost immediately. According to a Kansas City Star article from the opening, tourists flocked to the nearby town of Eldon to see the dam, taking the residents completely by surprise. Hotels filled up in surrounding towns overnight. Newspaper articles bragged about hundreds of miles of scenic shoreline, islands to be discovered, ideal sites for summer homes. They also warned that the upper reaches were still dangerous. Floating logs from the cleared forests bobbed in the water, unseen hazards beneath a surface that looked placid and inviting. And here's where the story takes its most peculiar turn. Because the man who finished the dam, Louis Egan, president of Union Electric, was not much better than the man who started it. Egan was a classic 1920s empire builder, described by contemporaries as moose tall and aristocratic, the kind of executive who regarded a $30 million project as an extension of his personal fiefdom. He earned $68,000 a year, an astonishing salary for the era, and he treated the Lake of the Ozarks as his own private pond. In 1930, while the dam was still under construction, Egan had a lodge built for himself overlooking the lake site. Not just any lodge, a 29-room Adirondack-style retreat made of western white pine logs that were cut in Oregon, completely assembled into a building on the west coast, inspected and approved by Egan personally, then disassembled, shipped by rail to the Ozarks, and put back together on a bluff above the dam. The whole thing took 3 months to reassemble. Square wooden pegs and overlapping saddle notch joints held the logs together. Stones from local quarries formed the patios and a massive fireplace. The cost was $135,000. In $1930 during the Depression, while his workers were earning 35 cents an hour below. The lodge, known as Egan Lodge, later renamed Wilmore Lodge, had just 5 guest rooms because it was never intended for the public. It was reserved for Union Electric executives and their guests, politicians, business associates, people whose goodwill needed purchasing. Egan shuttled dignitaries in and out on private airplanes. The parties were lavish. The alcohol flowed freely despite prohibition. And the real business of the lodge, as federal prosecutors would later allege, was bribery. Egan was running a slush fund through Union Electric to make political contributions and buy influence, rebates, false expense accounts, private clubs where the powerful were entertained at company expense. As it turned out, Union Electric may not have even needed the hydroelectric power the dam was supposed to generate. Later analysis suggested the company went forward with the project, at least in part, to create the financial structures, the enormous capital expenditure, the subcontracts, the land deals, through which slush funds could be hidden and money could be moved to the right people. The dam was, in a sense, a $30 million washing machine. In 1943, the law caught up with Louis Egan the same way it had caught up with Walter Cravens. He was convicted of violating the Corrupt Practices section of the Holding Company Act of 1935. Union Electric paid an $80,000 fine. Egan paid $10,000 and was sentenced to 2 years. His appeals failed, and on December 31, 1943, the former $68,000 a year executive entered the federal penitentiary in St. Petersburg, Florida. So there you have it, the three principal architects of the Lake of the Ozarks. A lawyer who dreamed of damming a river and couldn't finance it honestly, a banker who tried to launder a failed portfolio through a land swindle and went to Leavenworth, and a utility president who built the dam, bribed politicians from his private lodge, and went to federal prison. The lake that 5 million people visit every year was born from the collective ambitions of men who each, in their own way, crossed the line between vision and fraud. Every family fishing off a pontoon boat, every college kid doing something regrettable at Party Cove, every retiree watching the sunset from the deck of a lakefront condo, all of them floating on top of a scheme. But something unexpected happened after the schemers went away. The lake, indifferent to the morality of its origins, became genuinely extraordinary. The 1930s and 1940s were lean years, as you'd expect. The Depression lingered, the war came, and the lake area developed slowly, driven more by stubbornness than strategy. As historians Leland and Crystal Payton wrote, through the hard-time 30s, the traumatic war years 40s, and into the early 50s, utilization of the lake was spotty and disorganized, but persistent. Mom and pop dreamers built their own businesses from native rock and sold locally crafted souvenirs alongside cokes and camels. Small fishing cabins appeared along the shoreline. Families from Kansas City and St. Louis began making annual pilgrimages to the lake, renting the same cabin from the same family year after year, building relationships that would last for decades. The transformation accelerated in the 1940s and 1950s, and it was driven by two things: roads and regulations. As highways improved, particularly U.S. Route 54, which ran right past the dam, the lake became accessible to a much larger population. Suddenly, you could drive down from Kansas City or St. Louis in a few hours, spend the weekend fishing or water skiing, and be home by Sunday night. And in a twist that would have made Ralph Street's head spin, the New Deal regulations that put limits on utility companies forced Union Electric to sell off most of the shoreline it owned. A St. Louis real estate developer purchased the land in 1945, and that opened the floodgates, metaphorically this time, for private development. The lake's shoreline, unlike most federal reservoir projects, was privately held. That distinction was everything. Army Corps of Engineers lakes have restricted shorelines, managed for flood control, with limited development. The Lake of the Ozarks had 1,150 miles of buildable waterfront owned by private citizens who could do whatever they pleased with it. And they did. But it was two true locals, people whose roots in the Ozarks predated the lake, who first understood what the lake could really become. Lee Mace was an Army veteran who returned to Missouri from Korea in the early 1950s and saw something that the outside investors had missed. The tourists didn't just want a lake, they wanted entertainment. In 1953, Lee and his wife Joyce opened Lee Mace's Ozark Opry, a hillbilly music show on the lake that became a cultural institution. The Opry ran nightly performances, eventually got a television show on KRCG, and for decades was the single biggest draw for visitors who wanted something to do after the sun went down. As historian Dan William Peake put it, the Maces were the first ones locally to recognize that the lake could be a commercial fulcrum, that they could actually profit from figuring out what people wanted to do. The Opry influenced entrepreneurs far beyond the lake. Down in Branson, Missouri, 100 miles to the south, similar music shows began opening in the 1960s and 1970s, a direct line from Lee Mace's stage to what Branson eventually became. The Mesas also opened Indian Burial Cave as a tourist attraction, helped found the Central Bank of Lake of the Ozarks, and developed real estate around the lake. They were builders in the truest sense, people who made something where nothing had existed, without stealing anyone's land to do it. Lee Mace loved to fly. On a day in 1985, his private plane crashed near his home, and he was killed. Joyce continued running the Opry for another 2 decades after his death, finally closing the doors in 2006. The old auditorium sat empty for 7 years. Then, in 2013, it burned. Meanwhile, the Bagnell Dam Strip, the commercial district that grew up on the road above the dam, had its own long arc. In the 1940s and 1950s, it was the heart of the lake's tourism economy, a neon-lit, pedestrian-friendly stretch of motels, restaurants, souvenir shops, and amusement arcades that served as the first thing visitors saw when they crossed the dam. The strip was where construction workers had once bought supplies during the building of the dam. After completion, the businesses simply pivoted to serve vacationers instead. For decades, the strip was the lake's commercial soul, the place where families strolled after dinner, where teenagers cruised, where the sounds of country music spilled out of open doorways and mixed with the smell of fried catfish. But the strip's fate was tied to the road it sat on. When US 54 was rerouted in 1968, bypassing the strip entirely, traffic patterns shifted and the slow decline began. Development moved south to Osage Beach and the Grand Glaze area, where newer, bigger attractions could be built on larger parcels. The strip didn't die. It's still there, still open for business. But it lost its primacy, and some of the old buildings began to hollow out. In recent years, a $300,000 community development block grant funded the demolition of 23 structures on and around the strip, including the former Shoreland Motel, to clear the way for redevelopment. The past being torn down to make room for a future that looks nothing like it. The lake itself just kept growing. By the 1960s, over 100,000 people a year were visiting. Tours of the hydroelectric plant inside the dam drew 50,000 annually on their own. It was one of the biggest attractions in central Missouri. The Lake of the Ozarks State Park, established on 17,500 acres of land that had been set aside during the original construction, became the largest state park in Missouri. And tucked inside that park, at Anderson Hollow Cove, a tradition began in the 1960s that would become the lake's most infamous contribution to American recreational culture. Party Cove, where thousands of boats would raft together on summer weekends for multi-day floating celebrations that were, by any reasonable standard, bacchanals. The Missouri State Water Patrol estimated that at its peak, Party Cove attracted up to 3,000 boats during 4th of July weekend. In 2007, the commander of nearby Fort Leonard Wood declared the cove off-limits to Army personnel after a soldier broke his neck and 2 people drowned in separate incidents there. Through all of this, the resort boom, the strip's rise and decline, Party Cove's anarchy, the steady accumulation of condos and marinas and restaurants along those 1,150 miles of shore, the lake kept its secrets underwater. Divers occasionally explored the submerged ruins of old Linn Creek, though visibility was poor and there wasn't much to see. The town had been burned and pulled down before it was flooded, so what remained was mostly foundations and rubble rather than standing buildings. The iron smelter at Irontown still poked above the waterline as a reminder. The ruins of Arnholt's Mill sat somewhere on the submerged south bank of the Big Niangua. But mostly the lake just covered it all and reflected the sky back, as lakes do. Egan Lodge, the 29-room monument to one man's extravagance and corruption, survived better than most things from the lake's origins. It was renamed Wilmore Lodge at some point after Egan's disgrace and conviction, placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1998, and today serves as the home of the Lake Area Chamber of Commerce and a visitor center with a small museum about the dam's history. The electric chandeliers that Egan installed, electric naturally since the man ran a power company, still hang from the ceilings. The stones from local quarries still form the fireplace. If you walk through the front door and stand in the great room, you're standing in the place where a convicted felon once served illegal liquor to politicians whose votes he was purchasing, in a building assembled from logs that were shipped by rail from Oregon because ordinary Missouri timber wasn't good enough for him. Today, tourists pick up brochures. 2 turbines inside Bagnell Dam have never been removed since their installation in 1930. They are still spinning. The dam has not gone a single minute without someone working inside it since 1931. The generators produce 176 megawatts at standard capacity, 220 at overload. The Osage hydroelectric plant began commercial operations on October 16, 1931, and has been feeding electricity into the St. Louis grid ever since, through depression and war and boom and recession and everything else. Whatever you think of the men who built it, the machine works. And now the lake is entering yet another chapter. In 2022, developers announced Oasis at Lakeport, a project originally estimated at $300 million that has since grown to $500 million, a 400 one-room Marriott resort, an amusement park with roller coasters, and a 200-foot-tall observation wheel, an indoor water park, an amphitheater, 200 public boat slips. The goal, developers say, is to make the lake a year-round destination, to fill the winter months when the water is cold and the strip is quiet. The first phase was to open in summer 2025. But the project hit turbulence when a key development partner declared bankruptcy, and as of the latest reports, the timeline has slipped. Whether it becomes what the developers promise, or joins the long list of ambitious schemes that have swirled around this lake since 1912, nobody can say yet. What can be said is that the pattern, outside money arriving with big plans and bigger promises, transforming the lake and the lives around it, enriched by the same shoreline that was taken from the people who lived here first, has not fundamentally changed in 100 years. The Ozark families who were displaced, the ones who traded their bottomland for failed Kansas farms or simply got pushed out, were never made whole. Renters, share tenants, and squatters lost the most because they had no title to sell. They simply lost their homes. Some moved to Camden or the new Linn Creek. Some went to Kansas City or St. Louis and tried to start over as urban laborers. Some drifted to other hollows deeper in the Ozarks where nobody was building anything yet. The people who had lived on the land longest, the true locals as they came to be called, watched as outsiders from the cities built vacation cabins on the same hills where they had raised corn and children. And gradually, painfully, some of them found a foothold in the new economy. They became fishing guides, resort owners, shop clerks, boat mechanics. They adapted because the alternative was to disappear, and Ozark people have never been much for disappearing. Today, the lake generates billions in economic activity across 4 Missouri counties. Camden County's population has grown from a few thousand in 1930 to over 42,000. The area supports thousands of jobs in tourism, hospitality, real estate, and marine services. The Netflix series Ozark, though filmed in Georgia, put the name back in the national consciousness and brought a new wave of visitors who wanted to see if the lake really looked like it did on screen. It does, and it doesn't. The show's version is shadowy and menacing. The real lake is mostly just big, relentlessly, extravagantly big, a dragon-shaped body of water coiling through the hills, its surface glittering in the summer sun, its depths holding everything that was there before. The Osage people, for whom the river was named, had been removed from the region long before Ralph Street ever arrived. They called themselves the Wajaji, the children of the middle waters. They believed their ancestors had descended from an above world to a middle world, and that a great elk had helped them survive. They hunted across the Ozark Plateau and into the Great Plains for centuries before European settlement. By treaty, they ceded their Missouri lands in 1808. By the 1920s, they were living in Oklahoma, where oil had been discovered on their allotments, making them briefly the wealthiest people per capita in the world, a wealth that brought its own wave of fraud, exploitation, and murder, a parallel story of outsiders finding value in land and taking it. The river kept their name. The lake didn't. There is a particular quality to a place that was made rather than discovered. A place where every acre of water represents an acre of land that someone lost. The Lake of the Ozarks is not a natural wonder. It is a decision made by men in Kansas City and St. Louis offices, carried out by 20,000 laborers at 35 cents an hour, financed through a tangle of shell corporations and slush funds that sent 2 of its 3 principal creators to federal prison. It drowned 8 towns and displaced thousands of families to generate electricity for a city 175 miles away. And then it became beloved. That might be the most unsettling part of the story. Not the fraud, not the displacement, not the corruption. Those are familiar enough. What's unsettling is how completely the lake's beauty has overwritten its origins. 5 million people a year come here and see paradise. They see blue water and green hills and boats full of happy families. They don't see the courthouses and the churches and the kitchen tables where deals were signed by people who didn't understand them. They don't think about Walter Cravens shuffling into Leavenworth, or Louis Egan spending New Year's Eve 1943 in a prison cell in Florida. They don't think about the farm families who ended up with worthless Kansas dirt while their bottomland became some of the most valuable lakefront real estate in the Midwest. The lake doesn't think about it either. It just sits there, filling the shape the river left behind, holding its 1,000 miles of shore in place, turning its turbines, reflecting whatever you point at it. Wilmore Lodge stands on its bluff above the dam, the logs from Oregon still holding, the chandeliers still lit. Down at the waterline, the iron smelter at Irontown breaks the surface like a finger pointing at the sky. And somewhere under Anderson Hollow Cove, or maybe in the deep channel where the Osage used to run free and fast before anyone thought to stop it, a church bell sits in the silt and the dark, waiting for a current strong enough to make it sing again. The locals say it still does, sometimes, late at night, when the boats have gone quiet and the strip has closed and the lake lies flat and black under the stars. You won't hear it unless you're listening, but it's there. The bell is there, the town is there, the lake is there. Missouri's biggest playground doesn't forget what's underneath it. It just doesn't talk about it much.